So as I said, in order to talk about resumes, we must also talk about the resume's stricter, more detail-oriented friend, the application. And so I have had job seekers ask me multiple times over the years, why on earth does an employer ask me to put on a resume my work history, my education, and my skills, format that resume, attach it to an application, and then type into the whole application my work history, my education, and my skills? Is this a method of torture? Why are they doing this? It is not a method of torture, though it might feel like it sometimes. And the reason that you are asked to do these two things separately, to do both of them, is that the application and the resume have completely different jobs, even though they have a lot of the same content. The application is a legal document, hence it is stricter and more detail oriented. It's created by the employer. It is their screening tool to make sure that the people that they take the time to interview are already qualified for at least the minimum of the position. The resume is a marketing tool created by you. I will say it again, it is your marketing tool. And so you have control on that resume over what you're highlighting to make sure that you are making a strong case for yourself for each position that you're applying for. So some quick tips on applications. If you attended last week's Creative Job Search workshop, there was a section on that as well. We're going to be kind of breezing through this time around. But some good things to know for application. Read the instructions because not every online application is going to have the same ones. And if you can, look over as much of that application as you can ahead of time so you see what are they going to ask for? Is there any information that you need to gather ahead of time so that you're not having to pause that application, go look up what was my end date at this position, what was the address for this employer. So that way you're able to just quickly get through it. Quickly can be a relative term because depending on the application, sometimes it can take around an hour to complete. And I'll note that when I say application, I'm not referring to that short form that can pop up if you try to apply for something through Indeed. I know a lot of folks use Indeed and they have a really slick, quick application process where you enter your name, phone number, email address, resume, hit the button, off it goes. And while that can be really efficient and can be really appealing because it doesn't take too much time, that mostly will not be all the information that an employer needs. And so often what will happen is that works as an interest form. And then if they want to invite you to continue, they say, okay, fill out our application now. So there are many steps to many things in the job search process. So if you can remove one of those steps, I recommend, if possible, always try going to the employer's website directly and going to their career section. Usually you can find a link itty bitty at the very bottom of the screen and check out if they have their own online application. So that way you can save yourself a step. But all that to say, it can take some time. Some applications will ask for your last 3 positions that you've worked in. Some will ask for your last 10 years of experience and employment and unemployment, and they will not let you go forward if you leave even 1 month unaccounted for. So it really depends on the employer and the position. And you'll want to make sure that you have time to create a targeted resume for that position, which goodness knows we'll be talking about that. And we'll also get in your cover letter ready to go. So allow yourself time. Don't rush through it if you can help it, because otherwise it can get very stressful. Some good things to note for the application as well is to fill out everything. If something's not applicable to you, you can put in NA or not applicable, but try not to leave anything blank because blank can be looked at by an employer and they can wonder, did they forget to fill this out? Do they not want to fill this one out? Why is this not answered? And so if you're putting in NA, then at least they're saying, oh, okay, this doesn't apply. And so don't leave the employer with any questions. You want to make sure you're reading the small print at the end. This often can look like a big old block of legalese right toward the end of the application, right before they ask you if you want to sign or e-sign, however it would work. And a big block of text like that can sometimes just scream, I am very boring, it's okay to skip me. Don't fall for it. It is important to make sure that you're reading that small print. And often within that little block of text will be a statement, something to the effect of, I confirm that everything in this application is true and correct to the best of my knowledge. I acknowledge that if it is found not to be true or correct, my employment may be terminated. It also talks through at-will statements and other important things to know about what that employment will be. So if you're going to sign it, make sure you read it. And finally, last good tip for applications, keep good records. It will save your sanity. If you are applying for a number of different positions every week, that can be a lot of information. Often online applications will each ask you to make a username and password for their application. And as things tend to go, probably they'll have slightly different rules for each password, and it can set your head spinning. And so, if possible, pull up a spreadsheet, have a piece of paper, whatever works best for your style. And I recommend keeping a record of what date did you apply, the name of the employer, the job title. If you can find the job ID number, that's often toward the top of a job description, and it's a unique number that will be assigned to that opening. So that way it will distinguish between this position and the same position, but 500 miles away. And then you would also want to include the username and password information for that application and any other relevant information. That might be if you make a secret question in case you forget your password. It can be really frustrating if you are trying to get in to check the status of your application, you don't remember your password, it asks you a security question, it says, where did you grow up? And you know the answer is St. Paul, but you don't remember if you put the whole word Saint or ST period, or was it all capitalized? And if you try each one of those, it might be enough attempts that you could get locked out, and that just makes life stressful. So keep good records. It can make things much easier as you're going through your job search. Ultimately, remember that the application is one of the first impressions that you'll leave with the employer. There are people who are in that HR department who know nothing else about you except what is on your application. So make sure you're making a good first impression. So now that we have talked through applications briefly, let's get into resumes. So the goal of this workshop is that you walk away feeling like you have a good understanding of key resume basics. You know the basic sections of the resume. You know the importance of targeting your resume and how to do that. You understand some of the formatting options that are available to you and the importance of using the right one for you and how to know what that is and what an accomplishment statement is, an accomplishment statement and how it can be used to sell your skills on your resume. And finally, a little bit about cover letters, the basic content to include. And so it is a lot of content. So we will just get started. So right here, we have the question, is there a perfect resume? And the answer, the very short answer to that is no, there is not. The reason for that is that a resume is a very personal document. It is answering questions specifically about you and specifically about the job description that you are applying for. And so what Career Force staff do and what I'm going to be doing today is offering best practices and strategy advice. And keep that in mind as we're going through the workshop. Ultimately, the most important thing is that you feel comfortable with your resume and that you can confidently sell your skills and your background when you're interviewing. And so, as we saw in the kind of icebreaker question this morning, there are some interesting advice out there for resumes. And the more you read and research, you might find conflicting advice. You probably will. And so, when this happens, some important questions to ask yourself are first, is this advice directed to a job seeker in a specific industry or with a specific background? And does that match the industry I'm in or the background I have? And also just ask, is this what's right for me? Is this advice going to result in a resume that highlights my strengths in a way that I want it to? Because ultimately, you can have a pretty resume, you can have an exciting resume, you can have an interesting resume, but the only test, the only real one for whether your resume is effective is it generating interviews for the positions you want? If it's not getting you interviews, it's not doing its job. If it is getting you interviews, but they're all for positions you're not interested in or for positions that you did 15 years ago, it's not doing its job. It's only doing its job if it's getting you the interviews for the positions that you want. So, since resumes can be so many things and they're so individual, what are some things that are good best practices overall? We're going to talk through some of those. First of all, you want to make sure it reviews your qualifications for the position you're applying for. And that is key because if I were to walk up to you and say, tell me your qualifications, that might be a confusing question because you might want to know my qualifications for giving a presentation, my qualifications for playing basketball, my qualifications for juggling chainsaws, what is it? And that's an important thing to keep in mind because you don't want your resume to leave any room for doubt of what kind of qualifications you are including. So make sure it's a review of your qualifications for that position. We're going to keep coming back to targeting to the job description because it is incredibly important. You want to keep the information essential and essential to that position. So you want your resume to be focused, to include only items that help market you to the employer. You want it to be so that wherever the employer looks on your resume, it shows a reason that they should interview you. You want it to make sure that it is focusing on your skills and on the accomplishments that were made using the skills that made you good at your job. And you want it to be about what makes you unique. What is the reason that you doing this job resulted in success? You want it to market you properly. Again, this is a marketing product. It's a marketing tool. And so it's about you. You want to draw attention to your best skills and qualifications that match the job posting you're applying for. You will know it's effective if it's getting you those interviews. And some ways that can help it be effective are kind of simple ones. Make sure it has a nice, straightforward appearance. It's targeted to the employer. It's quick to read. It's easy to read. It makes the employer not have to do much work to understand why you fit this position and how. And finally, you want that resume coming right back around to be specific to each position. Make sure it shows that employer that you're the best fit for their position. And so a couple other basics here. You are, again, wanting to keep it simple, keep it focused. This is not going to be a complete history of your professional life. This is only a preview. You can think of it like a movie trailer, just enough to get the employer interested, enough to get them the gist of what you're bringing to the table, and then wanting to know more. So you want it to be a quick and easy read. You want the sections to be clear. You don't need to put things in full sentences because it's not an essay. It's just a marketing document. And it's a fluid document. It's a living document. It doesn't need to be set in stone and this is your resume forever. So if it's not working, change it. That is your right. That is your prerogative. All right. So we were talking about visuals and keeping something visually simple. And I love this slide because I think it really shows in a way that is hard to show otherwise what it can be like to go over different types of resume. So let me explain what you're looking at here. This image comes from theladders.com, and they did a study with a scientific method called eye tracking. And it shows the heat from a recruiter's eyeballs as they moved over to resumes. And so where you see the yellow and the red, that's where they spent more time looking at that spot. The blue means they spent some time looking. And if you don't see any color over a spot on a resume, that means they did not look. So I'm going to talk about these, but just briefly in the chat. I'd like to hear in a couple words, what do you notice about, we'll say the one on the left first. I know it's hard to read them, but just the overall, what it looks like, the overall format you can tell, and where the employer looked. I see no white space, too much info. Yeah, we got a whole big block of text here. Too long of a paragraph at the end on the left, too much info, too wordy. All right, we seem to have a consensus. And yes, thank you, Joanna. Unread paragraph at the end. Not only is this a big block of text, which, as we've seen on the application, can sometimes say, I'm very boring, skip me. Yes, thank you, Ashley. Then that is exactly what happens. They do. And so you might have some very important information down here. This is where you're putting the information that is most important to that job position that you're applying for, then you have kind of sabotaged yourself because you've hidden it. And so you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that the information that is most relevant to the position and that will make the strongest case for you is on the top third of the page. You want to make sure that it is easy to read, that there's a little white space. So yes, thank you all of you for kind of taking a look at that and adding your 2 cents. So then what do you notice about the one on the right then in comparison to the one on the left? What do you see of the format from what you can see of it? And what do you see of how the recruiter looked over this particular resume? Not great margins. You are correct. There are barely any margins there, and that is an issue. And we will talk about that. Thank you. Concentrated on education. Yeah, there is a big old flame right there over the education. But yes, it was reviewed from top to bottom. You can see that there are lists, there are white space, you can see where the highlights are, you can see where the sections are. It might still need more white space, but in general, you can see that the recruiter looked over this resume fully. You can see that at least each section was touched on, if not read closely, they were looking at all of it. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the formatting of your resume. Watch out for those blocks of text, those rectangles of text. If you're noticing those, then that might be a time to kind of reimagine what that can look like or how you want to share that information. And kind of something that ties right into that is you want to make it scannable. And this has a double meaning here because you want to make it scannable by a recruiter so that they can quickly look it over in a short amount of time and get the information they need. You also want to make it scannable by the robots, which is to say the applicant tracking software that a lot of employers use. Some of you may have had some encounters with applicant tracking software. I've heard many opinions about it, and it can be frustrating because it's frustrating when you are putting something into essentially a machine and it's deciding whether you move forward sometimes. And so something that is some good news here is that a lot of the things that can make something easy to scan for a machine are also the things that make it easy to scan for a human. If you're using really fancy font, that can be fun, but it can be misread by scanning software. And it also can be hard to read for somebody. It can be harder on the eyes. If you are using a fancy format that has stuff all over the place, it can be fun to do that, or it can look cool, but that can also be hard for an applicant tracking software to read, and it can be confusing for a person to read. So some of the same ideas are happening here. So when it comes to applicant tracking software, do some research. What you might notice is if you are completing an application on a company website, you'll see the point where you have been moved from their website onto the applicant tracking software website. Because when you are looking at the job description, it might even be before you are looking at the job description. You'll notice that the web address is company.com or companyname.com. But then once you have clicked into the job description or to the application, you might notice a different web address. It would say ICIMS or Workday or something like that. Those are a couple of applicant tracking systems that are pretty widely used. And so pay attention to that, and then you can Google that. You can see what can you find for tips submitting a resume through that applicant tracking system. Because that's the thing. Different systems may have different criteria. So there's not one piece of advice that's going to work for all applicant tracking software as well. So some good rules of thumb in general for making it scannable are to keep it simple. And you can, if you know what to look for with the type of applicant tracking software for the position you're applying for, follow those rules as you can. But keeping it simple ultimately will help to keep from distracting from the content, because that's ultimately what you want to make sure that people can see, the content, the information about you, your relatable skills, your work history. So let's talk about that content a little bit. But before we do that, it looks like there might be a question in the chat. Oh, how's it going, Art?
Good. Just wanted to make sure you knew that I wasn't leaving you all alone here. It's just been we've had a lot of great conversation. I'll be able to answer quite a few of the questions in the chat box.
Great.
I did want to. There was several questions about transferring careers and that sort of thing of how do I create a resume towards a new career. And how do I find the skills that are relevant? And I'm just going to put this into the chat because I think everyone could benefit from it. You might be talking about this a little bit later. All links will be sent in the follow-up email in case you don't want to try copying them off here, but some people like the immediacy of it. We do have something called a compare skills tool that allows you to take your past work history, compare it to a new industry, and find what transfers over. I did want to bring up something that was a comment from your introductory question, and that was, have you ever received any bad advice? And it relates directly to what you're talking about. I'm sure some of you have heard, and I'm sure Vanessa's heard, about turning your text white to put a whole bunch of keywords in from the job posting. Vanessa, what are your thoughts about that? About trying to trick the applicant tracking system?
I think that generally it's not a good idea to do, and that you can create a stronger resume by making sure that you're speaking the language of that job description in your description of the work you've done. If you have skills that have overlapped or you have experiences that overlap with what that job description is asking for, then look at how they talk about that. For example, if I have experience as a trainer and then someone's saying they want facilitating experience, I have called it training and not facilitating in the past, but they're talking about the same type of skill. And so then I might talk about that on my resume as facilitating. And so it's once again one of those things where the same things that can help a machine can also help the person who's going over your resume, because it makes it much easier for someone to draw a line between your information on your resume and your skills and the qualifications that are needed on that job description. So I think don't try to trick it, because that can also just show up on the applicant tracking software anyway, because sometimes they can only read text and the text is still there no matter what color it is. So then they'll see a big block of keywords on there, which some people do a skills section for that, and that's just fine. We'll talk about a skills section. But then you want to make sure that you are communicating that in the actual text of your resume. You don't need to hide it somewhere. If you're qualified, talk about it and speak the language of that job description wherever you can. Art, any other questions?
There are some questions I'm going to deal with in the chat about email, and I know you're going to get to that. But I think we're keeping up pretty good. A lot of conversation going. Thanks.
Wonderful. All right, we will keep moving, and there will be more opportunities for questions to be posed, and that I'll answer them a little bit later on. So let's talk about basics of resume content. As a reminder, your resume is your marketing tool. It's your selling tool. You are wanting to put the best information that matches the position you're applying for on that resume. And you want to keep it honest. That's very important. You always want to keep the resume honest. Inaccurate information could get you in trouble later. It could cost you your job later. And so even though you don't need to say everything that you have done in your career, and you don't need to put every work experience you've had, you want the information that is on that resume to all be true. And you want to keep it positive as well. You want to keep the focus on the skills and things you've achieved or accomplished, not just the tasks that you performed. Something that happens often on resumes is that the information about a place where someone worked, it ends up being kind of a laundry list of the tasks that were assigned to that person. And we'll talk about this more a little later, but if you're just saying, this is the stuff that I was supposed to do in my job, this is the stuff that was in my job description, that doesn't say anything about how well you did it or if you did it well. It doesn't say anything about what you would be bringing to the table in a position that you're applying for. And so you want to make sure that you're not just talking about what you did, but how well you did them. Specifically, why was it you? Why were you the person chosen to do this? What did you do to make things better in your workplace in this role? So focus on your accomplishments. And then you also want to make sure that, once again, you are targeting things, that you are focusing it on a particular skill or particular job. If you try to include all your experience and skills, you can make it harder for the employer to envision you in that position. It's harder for them to see you doing the job that they are hiring for. And so that can help the employer to see how qualified you are for this position. So in some cases, folks have a number of different skills that you have developed over time. If you have worked as a forklift operator and as a chef and as a babysitter at different times in your life, and you're applying for a job at a restaurant, you probably don't need to include your forklift skills on that resume unless you know from the job description that part of your job will be going in the back and getting the products using a forklift, which would be a very interesting position. I've not heard of it, but it might exist. So you want to make sure that things are relevant, that everything is answering the question, how do my skills match your needs? Because ultimately for you, it's a selling tool, and for employers, it's a screening and elimination tool. And so you want to make sure they have every reason to move forward with you. And one more thing before moving forward from this slide. If you have found that you are not getting to the interview stage and the feedback that you're getting is that you're overqualified, that might be an opportunity to take a look at your resume and what information is being provided and how focused is it. Because sometimes if someone is perceiving you as overqualified, it might mean that they are seeing things on your resume that are not relevant to the position because they're beyond it. And that might make them worry, well, are you going to be bored in this role? Are you going to move on to something higher up as soon as you can? And so for that, you want to make sure you're targeting that resume, and that maybe that means that you're not including everything you've done. And that doesn't devalue the other skills and experience you have. That can certainly be a bonus later on as you are getting started or things that you can share later on. But for the resume, the only job for the resume is to get to the interview. And so if they are worried that interviewing you will just result in you not choosing that position because you have found something that fits the additional skills you've included, then that might make things challenging. So if you are getting that feedback overqualified, take a look at your resume. You can set up an appointment with one of us at CareerForce and we can look over it with you and work out how to make it as effective as possible so that you are moving forward in that process. All right, so the last piece here of resume basics is about formatting. And so there are a couple different formats to choose from. We're going to be digging into a couple of them shortly, but there are things that you want to make sure that you are keeping in mind when you're formatting your resume. And we noticed some of those. Some of you pointed out some formatting things on the eye tracking looks. What is that? Eye tracking documents we were looking at earlier. So you want to make sure that the resume format you choose best presents your skills relative to the job description. And as I said before, that top 1/3 of that page is key. That is your golden section. So you want to make sure that's where the reader immediately sees your intention, which that could be a professional title, your professional profile, your summary statement, your objective. That is kind of the place where the most important information that you want them to know will go, because you want to grab that employer's attention during the first half of the page, because you have seen what happens if that attention tapers off. If they don't look at the whole resume, they're probably going to look at that top third. When it comes to the formatting, some of the things that you pointed out about the two resumes that we compared, white space is important. Having some room to breathe on that document visually can really make a difference in how readable it feels to somebody. So use bullet points. You want to avoid paragraphs. You don't want the text block. You want to make sure your margins, and thank you for the one who pointed out how narrow and itty bitty those margins were, even on the resume that was looked at widely. Ideally, you want to go for 1/2 inch to 1 inch margin. If you go wider than that, then your resume starts to kind of look like a funny little column down the middle of the page. If you go narrower than that, then sometimes the applicant tracking software might cut that off, and so they wouldn't be able to see the whole thing. And it can also just make it a little funny to look at visually, as some of you noticed. So keep those margins between 1/2 inch and 1 inch. For font size, ideally a good standard size would be 12. You don't want to go below 10 because that can just make it very difficult to read for somebody. So you want to make sure that it's font size 10 to 12. 12 would probably be best. And some of you may have gotten advice at some point about how you should always put at the bottom of your resume, references available upon request. And at this point, that's not something that is really expected or required anymore. It's no longer trendy in fashion for resumes. And so it's implied that you'll provide them if you're asked. So you can use that space to focus more on your skills. So when it comes to references, unless they're requested right away, you don't need to send them right away. You can start with the basics that are asked for, the application, the resume, the cover letter, unless that job advertisement calls for something additional. Or if they say something like, please email your resume and your references to this person to start this process. And if that is the case, you want to make sure you put your references on a separate sheet of paper. And this is important, keep the same name and contact information block or that header that you've used on your cover letter and your resume. Anyone who attended last week will know that what I'm talking about is called branding, that you are making sure that's very clear that each of those documents belong to the same person. They are all going to the same party. That is very important just for a professional look and just practical. If somebody printed out all your information and they had a very comical collision with somebody and the papers went flying, you want to make sure they can easily find your stuff and know that it all goes together. And finally, you want to keep it error-free. Edit, edit, edit. You want to make sure that you are using that spell check, you're using that grammar check, you are having someone look it over. Feel free to contact us at Career Force if you want us to look over your resume for proofreading. We love that stuff. So please feel free. All right, so before we jump into formats, anything else that we want to touch on from the chat, Art?
So thanks everyone for keeping me extremely busy in the chat. A lot of questions going on. I do want to make one distinction about email. That some questions that come up about email and what is a good email account. When it gets kind of confusing when people are used to using Outlook as a program. It's also an email account now, which kind of replaces Hotmail and MSN.com. It's just another domain at which Microsoft offers a free web-based email account. And if you create one there, you get a lot of tools. In fact, you even get a free version of Word with it. And you get online storage and all sorts of different things. So there was quite a few questions on that. And then someone had asked a question about, does applicant tracking software can they pick up bolding? Can they pick up various formats? And I just threw in that, old, very, very, very old applicant tracking systems might have had some issues with that, but any current applicant tracking software can pick up all of those formats. It's just the human eye is going to be distracted by them. The one thing to keep aware of, though, the one format that even the most sophisticated applicant tracking software has troubles with is a text box. So if you insert a text box as a way of easily formatting your resume, because you can move it anywhere you want, it won't necessarily catch that. So a lot of great questions in the chat feature, but you're covering it all. In fact, you're covering a lot of the questions as they ask them. So thanks.
All right, great. We'll keep rolling. So let's talk about formats. You saw a couple of format examples that we were looking at with all the iHeat stuff. And so I'm going to talk through 3 basic formats and kind of the situations in which they might be the most effective. So those 3 will be the chronological format, a functional or skills-based format, and a combination of the 2. Ultimately, no matter what format you use, target to the position you're applying for, and the type of format that works best for you may change over time, depending on what you do in your professional life, what direction you decide to take it, if you decide to change careers, if you decide to return to a career. So take everything with a grain of salt. This information is a way to kind of show you some of what's possible. And then you have some wiggle room to be creative with it from there as well. So we will begin with a chronological style resume. If you have seen any example of a resume, it has probably been chronological. What a chronological resume does is highlights your most recent experience and de-emphasizes some of the positions you've held that are older. What you can see for Robert Doyle's resume here is that his summary talks about his intention, that he is a production assembler. That's how he introduces himself, with a lot of experience. He has a section for selected skills and expertise, which is all focused on production assembly skills. His most recent position where he worked was as a production assembler, and before that he was a circuit board assembler, which is very similar. And his education focuses on soldering and process training, as well as his formal education. And so if you look at any spot on this resume, you are probably going to get a sense of production assembler. And so this style of resume really serves Robert here because it is showing that he has consistent employment history, that his most recent employment is related to the position that ostensibly, based on his summary, that he wants. And so that's where a chronological resume can be very helpful. If you have a consistent employment history, don't have many gaps in employment, if this is something where your recent work history is consistent with your career goals, those can all be great situations to use a chronological style resume. Where this may not be the best format is if someone has some job gaps, or if you're a recent graduate and don't have a lot of related work experience yet in the field, or if you're changing careers, because it comes down to what are some of the first things the employer sees. And in this case, one of the first things they see after your intention and the selected skills is your most recent work experience. And so you want that next thing to be the recent work experience if that helps you in the position you're applying for. So that is a chronological resume. A skills-based resume or functional resume is an excellent one for somebody who's a new job seeker. If you are just starting out, if you really don't have previous work history and this is the beginning of your career journey, this may be the one for you. What you can see here is that it also starts out with qualification headlights. There's a spot for an objective, for an intention. And so right at the top, once again, you're seeing that this person is saying, here's the most important stuff that I want you to know. And please read the rest, but this is the really important stuff. So they have that right at the top. Next is an accomplishments section. And so that is where it differs from that chronological resume. That instead of saying, here's the most recent job I had, especially if there is not one, then it shows here are some accomplishments in some different areas of and different skill sets. And the beautiful thing about that is that it's very flexible to target to a job description. And so if you are looking at that job description, you see what's important to that employer. And if you know you've got skills in that area, then you can say, oh, you are interested in production assembly skills? Let me tell you about my production assembly skills, or what have you. And so it's very flexible, it's very malleable. And then what you'll find after those accomplishments is education, training, and personal development. And so that's where you can list, here are some of the places that I built these skills. But you notice it's at the bottom, it's not really what is highlighted the most, because you don't want the highlight to be, I have never done this kind of work before. You want the highlight to be, here are all the things that I know how to do that you are asking for. And so this is why it can be really helpful for a new job seeker, because it focuses on skills and accomplishments that you can have built anywhere. So you may be thinking, okay, but what if I have plenty of work experience, but I'm looking to change careers, or I've had some gaps in my employment? What works best for me? The combination resume is going to be your best friend. And this, you'll see it very much does combine the two styles that we just talked about. So Susan here in her summary statement says she's an experienced security professional with military, medical, and firefighter background. And that and the rest of her summary make a pretty clear statement of her intention. She wants to work in security. Next, she goes into selected skills and experience, very similar to that functional resume we just looked at. And so she focuses on building a personnel security, emergency management and prevention, leadership, and customer service, all very focused on security related work and skills. And as you read through this, there's a lot of fantastic qualifications to work in security. And so she's really making a strong case for herself. It is only toward the bottom of the page that you see the employment history as an infantryman, a valet, and a bartender. And what is not here? Any security position. She may be looking to change careers or to move into civilian careers after coming out of the military. And in this case, this can be a helpful format because when the employer is looking at the top part of that resume and seeing all these wonderful skills that are very related to the type of work she's wanting to do, that's dazzling. That's the information they're getting first. And so then when they're looking at the job titles, then they can go, well, okay, she's never worked in this role before, but look at the skills that she has. Whereas if the first thing that they see is a job title, they might go, oh, she's never worked in security before, next. So these are some different formatting options to keep in mind depending on your personal situation and what you're wanting to do next in your career. So as we looked at those three, very different formats, but in general, they all kind of had the same core 4 sections. And one of them is kind of either or, but we're going to talk about what those are. Some things that generally should always be on a resume. To start with, the easiest section, contact information. Very important. So some things to keep in mind for your contact information are use your full name, try to avoid nicknames. With street address, you may notice on this example that there is not a full street address, just a city and state. And these days, it is starting to be more common to not include the full street address. One reason for that is that it can be a security concern. If someone prints your resume and the wind takes it away and it gets lost, then whoever finds it has your name and full address. But then also we don't want this to happen, but it does happen sometimes. It could allow you to be geographically profiled. And so it will be required on the application. It's not like it's something that you will not be sharing with the employer at all, but on your resume, that's not something that's required. As a best practice, we also encourage you to pick one phone number to make it simpler for the employer. It can be tempting to put, well, I'm going to put 2, so that way there's a backup. And if you can't reach me on this one, call me on this one. But then that can make it a little more complicated. They might wonder, oh, okay, so which one do I call? Or if the manager calls one number and the HR recruiter calls a different number, then that can cross their wires and it can make things difficult. So recommend one phone number to make it simpler, and make certain that it's a number that you'll answer most of the time. You don't need to state that it's a cell phone or a home phone. It is, they can guess. As long as it's your main number, that is all that matters. Also, related to calls, be aware of your outgoing voicemail message. I am curious if anyone here has listened to their voicemail message recently, because I haven't, to my personal one. It could be something that's really easy to forget about. And if you made that voicemail message 10 years ago, then you might not remember what was on it. And so I recommend checking it, making sure that it's professional, because goodness knows I have heard some things over the years. Songs that last the entire 2 minutes for that voicemail message while I'm sitting there waiting to leave my message for this person. At one point, that was just the sound of being jostled around in a purse for the full 2 minutes because I think the person didn't realize they were setting their voicemail and that they weren't done. And I spent the whole time wondering if they had accidentally answered or if I was really going to be able to leave a message. There are some that are kind of cutesy or some that are just friends goofing around. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you are applying for positions and you know that employers are going to be hearing it, you want to make sure it's representing you in a professional way. Same deal with the email addresses. I know there's been some discussion of email addresses in the chat. Keep it professional. If you have a personal email address that you've had for a long time, it's just cute, it's your inside joke, it's something like that. You don't have to get rid of it, but I would then in that case recommend just making a new email address specifically for your job search. That way, also, if your personal email address has 3,000 emails in it, like some people's, like the person giving this workshop, then you won't be getting communication from employers lost in that shuffle. Another thing to keep in mind is to, in your email address, avoid including numbers that appear to be the year of your birth. Ageism is not legal, but it happens. And so you want to make sure that you're not in any of your resume answering questions that an employer can't legally ask you. So it's just one little tip to kind of make that not be part of the conversation at all. Finally, for what you can see here at the bottom is a LinkedIn account. If your LinkedIn is active and up to date, include that. That is giving the employer one more way to connect with you and showing that you are comfortable using LinkedIn and using that online networking. The next basic resume part is the intention. And that's kind of an umbrella term that we're using for an objective or for a summary, professional profile, what have you. It's an indication of what you are bringing to the table and what you want to do with it. So you want it to be very specific to the position that you're applying for. If you are not able to update any other section of your resume to target to a position, target your intention because it's right there, smack at the top, and you are able to make it very, very focused on the position you're applying for. Try to avoid sort of wordy statements that are generic. I know that just about everybody has seen an example of a resume that says seeking a challenging position with a growing company. There's nothing wrong with seeking a challenging position with a growing company. That's a very normal thing to want, but it doesn't give a lot of information. And at this point, it's been a very common phrase to use in objectives. And so it kind of stops having meaning at a certain point. So you want to make sure that it's focused. What you can see in this example summary, creative and motivated engineer with more than 10 years of experience. This is not even a full sentence, but we already know what this person considers to be some strong skills of theirs, creativity and motivation. We see how they are introducing themselves professionally, an engineer, and one of the qualifications they're bringing to the table, more than 10 years. We have not even gotten to the period of this sentence yet. So that's something to keep in mind. Make sure that it is very specific to you. That said, it's all specific to you. Try to avoid using me-oriented words like I, my, me. That it's just generally assumed on a resume that you are talking about yourself. And so make sure that you are phrasing them, taking some of those out. So as you can see, just like in this summary, you're not saying I am a creative and motivated engineer, just creative and motivated engineer. The employer knows who you're talking about. The next one we're going to split. For the chronological resume will be, the next section would be professional experience. And that's where you put your work history in each entry for each employer or for each position, depending on what your work history has been. So you're listing your most recent employment first. A good rule of thumb for the whole resume, most recent first, because that shows what is going to be most relevant, the skills you've used most recently that are the most fresh. So you do that, you determine how far back you should go. Again, we've said we don't want to go past 10 to 15 years. And once you get past that, there are other ways to honor some of that work you've done previously in a different format. And we'll talk about that shortly. But on this, you can also include volunteer experience if you want to, if you don't want to have it in a separate section, if it's related. You just want to make sure that you're indicating that properly in the job title. This was a volunteer position. If we are using a skills-based resume or combination resume, then instead of professional history, the next section would be areas of expertise. And so again, this one is specific to engineering. And so you are saying, well, my qualifications related to engineering, which I know is something you're asking for, are this, this, and this. And so again, you can kind of pull from different experiences you've had, paid and unpaid for these, just as long as everything on the resume is accurate. But again, it's very flexible. It's a great way to target to different positions. And you can have different categories for every single position you apply for if you feel like it, as long as it is relevant to that position. And the last kind of core section here is an education section. And this is where you can list formal education. You can combine it with kind of certificates and professional development if you want, or you can have that as a separate section. If you have any college or any post-high school kind of formal education, you don't need to include your high school on the resume because it can be assumed that you completed a high school program or a GED program and qualified to attend a college program. And also to note on education, dates are optional. If it's more than 5 years old, you probably don't need to include it. Just know that education dates can suggest your age. They can suggest how current your academic knowledge is. And so you might want to take that into account. Even if you've still been using some of those skills over time, if that was something that you did 10 years ago, an employer might look at that and go, well, how fresh is this information really? So you don't need to include the dates, just note that you have done that. You have completed that education or done coursework in that area. And as a side note, again, this is the resume, this is the marketing tool. The more detail-oriented and stricter friend, the application, is probably going to ask for more detailed information about all these things. But finally, if the targeted position that you are applying for is not related to the subject that you studied, you don't need to include the subject you studied. You can just include that you had coursework or what kind of degree it was, a Bachelor of Arts or an Associate of Applied Science or whatever it is. You just want to make sure you're keeping it all relevant. In addition to the core four, here are some other optional resume sections you can include. It's not comprehensive, but depending on your experience and what your career journey has been, some of these might be very valuable to include on your resume. Military experience, volunteer experience, leadership, professional memberships, awards, recognitions that are related to the position you're applying for or the type of work you're applying for, training certificates. If you have older experience that you feel is more relevant, but you don't want to spend a lot of space on it, you can have a section that says additional relevant experience, and you can kind of summarize in a couple sentences your collective experience that's older than a certain point. So there, you can get really creative with it. So I would encourage you to connect with your local career force office if you want to kind of sit down with somebody and hash this out and figure out what might make the most sense for you. All right, we are making our way to the home stretch here, but I will give you a heads up. Put your thinking caps on. We are going to do a very brief activity in about It is 10 o'clock on the dot, so we are going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Creative Job Search, Tools of the Job Hunting Trade. My name is Vanessa East, and I'm a workforce development representative at CareerForce in Bloomington, and I've been working with job seekers and resumes for about 13 years. And with me is my intrepid colleague who will be keeping things running behind the scenes and keeping an eye on the chat. If you've attended previous workshops with us, you may recognize him, and I will let him introduce himself.
Thank you, Vanessa. My name is Art Larson. I am the Job Service Program Coordinator for the state of Minnesota. Happy to be with you here today to talk all about resumes and other tools. What I'll be doing is looking at the chat box, and the chat box is the bottom right-hand side of your screen. It looks like a speech bubble. For those of you who didn't get Vanessa's earlier messages, your mic has been muted, and the reason is we'll have upwards of 80 people on today's presentation, and we don't want to have a lot of crosstalk that will not allow us to get through all the material. So ask your questions in the chat feature. We're already getting some great conversations based on some questions that Vanessa posed earlier. Every few slides, I'll probably be able to turn my camera on, and that will let Vanessa know that there are some questions, and I will give her those questions so that she can concentrate on the content, and she'll answer a couple of them. If we don't get to your questions right away, it's because we are waiting for that section to come up in the slide deck. We also will get to as many questions as we can after today's presentation, but we've only got an hour to get through everything, so we'll keep it running smoothly. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. The presentation as well as a copy of the recording will be sent to everyone by the end of the day tomorrow. So you can look for that in the same email you received that we sent the invite to. Turn it back over to Vanessa and we'll get started.
Thank you. Now, to start us off, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. If you happen to be attending this workshop as a reemployment activity for your unemployment account, you've already got some homework. Once you've completed this workshop, you'll want to make sure and log into your unemployment account and mark that you've completed a creative job search workshop on today's date. That said, to everyone, regardless of your employment or unemployment status, you are welcome to attend any or all of these sessions. So let's talk about what these sessions are. For any of you who are tuning in for the first time, the Creative Job Search Series is a rolling 6-week series of workshops that zoom in on every stage of the job search process. Each workshop stands alone. You don't need to attend all 6 workshops unless you want to, but they follow the steps of the job search process more or less in order. So we are in week 3. Week 1 was focused on career planning and getting everything ready for your job search. Week 2 last week was focused on confidently communicating your skills, application tips, and talking through professional portfolios. Week 4 next Tuesday will be all about job interviews. Week 5 focuses on the online tools available to you in your job search, including the ingredients to a really strong LinkedIn profile. And week 6 is the ever popular Job Search Over 50. So bringing it back to today, we'll be focusing on, we'll say, resumes plus, because in order to talk about resumes, we also must necessarily talk about the resume's two good friends, the application and the cover letter. So while the bulk of today's workshop will be focused on best practices and techniques to build your most effective resume, it'll be bookended, kind of on either side, by a brief discussion of applications at the beginning and a brief discussion of cover letters at the end. We're going to be covering a lot of ground in the next 57 minutes, so let's get to it. So as I said, in order to talk about resumes, we must also talk about the resume's stricter, more detail-oriented friend, the application. And so I have had job seekers ask me multiple times over the years, why on earth does an employer ask me to put on a resume my work history, my education, and my skills, format that resume, attach it to an application, and then type into the whole application my work history, my education, and my skills? Is this a method of torture? Why are they doing this? It is not a method of torture, though it might feel like it sometimes. And the reason that you are asked to do these two things separately, to do both of them, is that the application and the resume have completely different jobs, even though they have a lot of the same content. The application is a legal document, hence it is stricter and more detail-oriented. It's created by the employer. It is their screening tool to make sure that the people that they take the time to interview are already qualified for at least the minimum of the position. The resume is a marketing tool created by you. I will say it again, it is your marketing tool. And so you have control on that resume over what you're highlighting to make sure that you are making a strong case for yourself for each position that you're applying for. So some quick tips on applications. If you attended last week's creative job search workshop, there was a section on that as well. We're going to be kind of breezing through this time around. But some good things to know for application. Read the instructions because not every online application is going to have the same ones. And if you can, look over as much of that application as you can ahead of time so you see what are they going to ask for? Is there any information that you need to gather ahead of time so that you're not having to pause that application, go look up what was my end date at this position, what was the address for this employer. So that way you're able to just quickly get through it. Quickly can be a relative term because depending on the application, sometimes it can take around an hour to complete. And I'll note that when I say application, I'm not referring to that short form that can pop up if you try to apply for something through Indeed. I know a lot of folks use Indeed and they have a really slick, quick application process where you enter your name, phone number, email address, resume, hit the button, off it goes. And while that can be really efficient and can be really appealing because it doesn't take too much time, that mostly will not be all the information that an employer needs. And so often what will happen is that works as an interest form. And then if they want to invite you to continue, they say, okay, fill out our application now. So there are many steps to many things in the job search process. So if you can remove one of those steps, I recommend, if possible, always try going to the employer's website directly and going to their career section. Usually you can find a link itty bitty at the very bottom of the screen and check out if they have their own online application. So that way you can save yourself a step. But all that to say, it can take some time. Some applications will ask for your last 3 positions that you've worked in. Some will ask for your last 10 years of experience and employment and unemployment, and they will not let you go forward if you leave even 1 month unaccounted for. So it really depends on the employer and the position. And you'll want to make sure that you have time to create a targeted resume for that position, which goodness knows we'll be talking about that. And we'll also getting your cover letter ready to go. So allow yourself time. Don't rush through it if you can help it, because otherwise it can get very stressful. Some good things to note for the application as well is to fill out everything. If something's not applicable to you, you can put in NA or not applicable, but try not to leave anything blank because blank can be looked at by an employer and they can wonder, did they forget to fill this out? Do they not want to fill this one out? Why is this not answered? And so if you're putting in NA, then at least they're saying, oh, okay, this doesn't apply. And so don't leave the employer with any questions. You want to make sure you're reading the small print at the end. This often can look like a big old block of legalese right toward the end of the application, right before they ask you if you want to sign or e-sign, however it would work. And a big block of text like that can sometimes just scream, I am very boring, it's okay to skip me. Don't fall for it. It is important to make sure that you're reading that small print, and often within that little block of text will be a statement, something to the effect of, I confirm that everything in this application is true and correct to the best of my knowledge. I acknowledge that if it is found not to be true or correct, my employment may be terminated. It also talks through at-will statements and other important things to know about what that employment will be. So if you're going to sign it, make sure you read it. And finally, last good tip for applications, keep good records. It will save your sanity. If you are applying for a number of different positions every week, that can be a lot of information. Often online applications will each ask you to make a username and password for their application. And as things tend to go, probably they'll have slightly different rules for each password, and it can set your head spinning. And so if possible, pull up a spreadsheet, have a piece of paper, whatever works best for your style. And I recommend keeping a record of what date did you apply, the name of the employer, the job title. If you can find the job ID number, that's often toward the top of a job description, and a unique number that will be assigned to that opening. So that way it will distinguish between this position and the same position, but 500 miles away.